Today we're going to be doing the most requested video I have ever had, and that is explaining my custom shifter on my automatic 350Z track car. It's pretty obvious why so many people have asked me about this, because there is nothing else like this on the market for the automatic 350Z. For whatever reason, there is zero support for this transmission, even though it is a pretty great automatic. The reason my car is an automatic, just to give a quick background, is because it was so much cheaper than a manual transmission car when I bought it 10 years ago. And if you're looking at an early 03 or 04 car, the manual transmission has a lot of problem with synchros, so I really didn't want to have to deal with that, and this was a daily driver at the time. Now that it's turned into more of a track duty car, the automatic has worked flawlessly. All I have to do is just pull my shift a little bit early, 300, maybe 400 RPM earlier than I want it to go off, give it a pull. The engine keeps climbing, and then boom, it changes quickly, it changes exactly the same every time, it never misses a shift. Downshifting while I'm braking is really not that much of an issue. You just have to adapt to the transmission, and it'll work really, really well, better than I could with a manual, that's for sure. But while the transmission is actually a really good transmission, the shifter is not so great. Number one, I think the shift pattern is all wrong. Pushing forward to upshift and pulling backwards to downshift doesn't make any sense to me, so I covered that in another video, which I will link up here on switching that, which was actually super easy. But the shifter, that was a little bit of trial and error. I tried several different items before finally stumbling on this setup. I'll explain what these two parts are on the bench in just a second, but I want to at least run through how it works before I show you the pieces of it. So right now it is in park, and I have jerry-rigged the release here so that it'll work without the engine on and the key turned, but normally you'd have to depress the brake to get it out of park, and the car would have to be on. But even then, if I just pull on the shifter, it's not going to do anything. I can't just push it into gear. I have to push down, and then I can go into reverse, neutral, and then drive. And then it'll come back up. Now, it's not very well greased right now. If it was greased properly, the spring would press it back up under its own power. But the motivation for this shifter was multifaceted. Number one, I did want something that looked better because I'm going to have to look at it every time I'm in the car, so it definitely doesn't hurt. But the main focus was functionality. So when I am in drive right here, this is the center line of the steering wheel, and I bring my hand over and it is right in contact with the shift knob. So when my hands are on the wheel and I'm driving, I can quickly reach over, change gear, and then come back to the wheel. I'm not going down. It shortened my distance quite a bit, and it has definitely made gear changes a lot easier on track than they were before. Now, the way this works is on your stock shifter, there is a button, so when you squeeze the shifter and you squeeze that little button there, it is pressing a lever sideways, which is then pressing a lever that is inside the mechanism down, and that's what's unlocking your transmission. I've just simplified that, and now the whole piece, which is bolted on right here, so that bolt goes through a little piece of plastic that sits on top of that lever, and that is what is being pushed up and down. So the whole mechanism moves down together, which has simplified it. I really drove it like this for years. It was never an issue. I have track driven it like this for even longer, and it has still never been an issue. It really does work flawlessly, and I really think it makes the interior look a lot better. Now, as far as the shift boot, that I just used a manual transmission pattern and had to cut that up and make my own. It is sandwiched in between that metal ring and a little plastic faceplate that's underneath it. So it's a little obnoxious to get it off and on, but I will have to take it off today to show you guys what's going on. So normally the way I install this is I'm going to have the shift boot flipped up. It's zip tied onto the bottom of the shaft here so it doesn't pop down while I'm driving around. And then I can apply it over the little faceplate and then very carefully press down this ring all the way around, and it holds it in with tension. It's worked extremely well. Once it's in, it's in. It's a little bit obnoxious to install, but it definitely works. But I'm going to disassemble the shifter, and I'll show you what we're working with. So here you can see the shift ring is removed, and we have the whole shifter out of the play. Here is the factory shaft that you would see if you had the factory shifter on, that little piece of silver. And I've got it wrapped in electrical tape in 3 different pieces. That's there to take up the gap in between the stock diameter and the inside of the pipe that I'm using as a shift lever. That will entirely depend on what brand of electrical tape you're using or whatever little spacer you want to 3D print to take up that gap. But what that's going to do is that's going to make sure that there's a tight fit between the pipe and the stock piece, so that when you pull back on the shifter doesn't wobble back and forth on the shaft there. It just pulls everything back in unison. So it takes a little bit of fine tuning, but once it is set up, it works flawlessly. You're going to have to keep it greased. I grease it probably once a year and it works perfectly fine. Then we have the plastic piece that sits on top here. So there's a little metal rectangular shaft that goes inside here, and that's what you press down to unlock it. This piece of plastic sits on top of it. And normally the stock button pushes across the top of this, and that's what presses it down and unlocks it for you. What I've done is I've drilled a hole through it so that that little screw can go through the pipe, through this piece here, and then slightly out the other side to make it a double shear. The only thing you're going to have to do to this is I take a very small washer and tape it to this. And what that is doing is making sure that the pipe doesn't get kinked by being pulled too far to one side, so it keeps it spaced slightly. So I'll show you that in just a second on the bench as well. But extremely simple mechanism, a little bit of electrical tape, the pieces I'll show you on the bench, and one screw. That is all there is to it. Believe it or not, this is what the shifter is made out of. This is some 1/2-inch copper pipe. So the interior diameter is 1/2 inch and the outside diameter is 5/8 of an inch. And you can do it on whatever length you want. I'll give you a measurement for this in just a second. We'll go measure it on my car. You have a set screw right here, and that's what's going to allow you to press down on the shifter to release the lock, so you can change into different positions. You can use whatever screw you like, coarse thread, fine thread, whatever you want to use, whatever to get the job done. But I've got it drilled on one side and not on the other. It just presses through. I think a pass all the way through would be a little bit more secure, because the double shear is always going to be better than single shear. But the top is actually a wooden egg. So I just took a wooden egg, drilled a 5/8 inch hole in the bottom about halfway through, set it on top of the shifter, and epoxied it in place. But the nice thing about wood is, number one, it does not get as hot or as cold as metal does, and it's also very light, and of course they're cheap. You can get wooden eggs all over the place. It's a nice size for a shift knob. It fits in your hand. It's got this little flat spot on the bottom, which I don't love. I wish it was just rounded, but they're designed to sit up like a decoration. But drill your hole, slot it on there, and you have something nice. It fits in your hand well. You can push against it. You've got a nice tall shift knob. And like I said, it's not going to get super hot or super cold like aluminum does. This is also super cheap. You can get this at any hardware store, Home Depot, Ace, Lowe's, whatever. And you can get this off the internet. You could probably get it at somewhere like Michael's as well if you wanted to get it local. So here is that plastic piece I was talking about. As you can see, mine has several holes drilled in it, 5 actually, 3 on one side and 2 in the opposite direction. There's a lot of fine tuning before I finally decided that towards the very bottom right here, that's the way I wanted to do it. And so this sits just inside here, and the screw goes through. And so when this whole shifter mechanism gets pushed down, it takes this with it and presses down to release the transmission and allow me to change gear. Here is the screw. So it's just a regular screw. I think this is actually an M4. You can use whatever works best for you. Like I said, I've got mine set up double shear, so it goes through this larger hole and just barely pokes through to the other side, just enough to actually contact it and to make it a double shear. I don't think it's necessary, but it's definitely not a bad idea. Here is the little washer that was taped on here, unfortunately, because the tape has been on here for several years. When I took this apart this time, the tape did crumple off, but it was just taped onto here so that when this sat inside the pipe, it was just enough of a spacer to press it one side or the other. So this can wiggle back and forth inside the pipe, but with the washer on here, it cannot wiggle back and forth. So it just took up enough space. It even has a little bit of a dish to it. I'm not sure if you can see that. So ever so slightly curved the washer to sit nice and gently against this and take up some gap in here. You can even put a washer on either side, or you could even wrap this in tape like on the other piece, just to make sure that this is not wiggling around in here, that it is nice and flush. Because if you're pulling it down to one side, it might kink this, and this down here is going to catch as it slides up and down the shaft of the transmission. So You want to make sure that your tolerances are nice and tight. You want to make sure that everything stays greased. But you can see here how this is in fact an egg. This is the same pipe. I just painted it silver. And then of course you've got your boot on here, and I've got it attached so that it doesn't come off. And this just sits around here. We've got the ring that goes around it, and you have a shifter. It's extremely easy, extremely cheap. I would say you could do the whole thing for $20, maybe $30 max, and really change your driving dynamic. You have to touch your shifter every time you get in the car. You don't have to touch it as many times as you do a manual transmission car, but it's going to change the look of the interior. It's going to look a lot more like a sports car instead of like the granny shifter that comes with the 350Z. And of course you can customize it. So this is your attachment point right here. That is a pretty standard length. So you can see right here where the pipe ends. It's the same length here on this pipe. Let me measure that out for you and I will come back. All right, so the distance from the bottom of this to the hole is 70 millimeters. So that is a fixed measurement. That will allow this to fully be depressed to release the transmission, but sit as low as possible to cover up as much of a stock shifter as you possibly can. Once you add the boot, it's not a big deal. But 70 millimeters, I think, is the perfect length from the bottom of the pipe to where your hole is drilled to go through the bottom of this plastic. You can, of course, adjust it to whatever you think is best, but that's my recommended length. Anything above that can be as long or short as you want it to be. So this one is set up shorter than my own because that is what someone requested when I was originally going to make these, and then that stopped. But I made mine longer so that it is the perfect height. So this is perfectly even with the center of the steering wheel. If you're doing drifting and you have a hydro e-brake and you want this to be at a different height to that or a different angle or whatever, you can adjust all these things to make it fit your car and your needs. I think the shortest you can buy this pipe is in 2-foot lengths anyway. So you're going to have more of an enough pipe. You have enough that you could probably make a second shifter. So if you wanted to have 2 different lengths for street and track or whatever you wanted to do with it, you can do that and you'll have the materials for it. So we'll go back over, we'll do one more shot in the car, just showing you a little bit of what we're doing. But really, that's all there is to it. If you have more questions, of course, you can hit me up on Instagram. But hopefully I'm explaining this well enough for you guys to follow. So take your whole shifter apart, keep this piece in, you're going to drill a hole through it, slide your pipe on, have the hole at the same height, run this little screw all the way through it, so that way they're connected so you can press down at the same time. 5/8" hole in the end of this egg here, and slide it over, epoxy it on. You can paint it whatever you want, black, silver, red, purple, it doesn't matter. And of course you'll have some sort of spacing in between these two, however you want to do it, and then some spacing between the stock shifter shaft and this one that we're adding on. Grease everything up, and you should be good to go. And then of course, shift boot if you want it. It's not necessary. You can do it with the stock faceplate. I did that for a little while. Hated the stock faceplate. I know where park, drive, reverse, all of that is. I don't need help with that. It also pops up in your little tack gauge, so it's down there at the bottom of what position you're in and or what gear number you're in. So you really don't need it. It's just a backup. So sewing this up, it's, I have 4 different triangles that you had to sew up, cut a little hole in the middle, make this all a circle, and then slot it on. I'm sure there's plenty of videos on how to sew a shift boot, but let's go hop back in the car. I'll show you this one more time, and then we'll call it a day. So as you can see, here is our stock shaft. We've got that tape on here as our spacer, and this is that little rectangular shaft I was talking about, that this is what you're gonna have to press down so that you can move into different gears. And this is the piece of plastic that sits on top of it. So normally, I believe it used to sit in this direction, but because I drilled so many holes in this and I needed to move things around to make it fit perfect, I did have to turn mine 90 degrees. Now, it's not designed to sit at 90 degrees, but it will do it. If you ruin the part number up here on screen, it's a little bit difficult to find. It took me a few years and I finally found it. And it's actually kind of expensive too. I think it's like a $25 piece of plastic, so try not to ruin it. But yeah, that's all there is to it. So even if you really didn't want to do all of that, all you would need to do to simplify this, if you just wanted to replace your shift knob, is you'd have to find some way of attaching this directly to the egg, which you could totally do. You could attach that to any shift knob and leave the stock length, leave all of it alone. and just press this down, and that's what you're going to use to change gears if you're not worried at all about having an extended shifter. This would be even easier if you had the ability to 3D print. So you could 3D print something that takes up this bottom space and then make this a larger diameter shaft. You could even, make it something that you could thread and then thread on a shaft. You could make it out of metal. You could do all sorts of things with it. It really just depends on how you're using your car and what you want the shifter to look like. So of course, feel free to ask me questions about this. You can ask me in the comments, you can ask me on Instagram, you can email me, whatever is easiest for you. If you need help with this or any further explanation, just let me know. I'm sorry, but I wasn't able to sell these. I was going to try and get that going, and it just didn't work out. But hopefully this is enough information for you guys to go out there and make them yourselves for a lot less money. So as always, hit that subscribe button, and I will see you guys next week.